negotiation done well is about creating something that drives mutual gain, right? Something that's going to be mutually beneficial for both of us. Because I want you to walk away from this feeling like you got something out of this deal, because the chances of us doing business together one day may be very high.
When you're heading into a negotiation, it's imperative that you understand the differences between what your needs are and what your wants are. But it's equally as important that you understand those differences for the other party, says today's Ask an Expert guest. Hi, I'm Joshua Carlsen, co-founder of Propelo Media, and today I sit down with Mark Raffan. He's the founder of a group called Content Callout. They help businesses develop content strategies, but they also take it further. They help you execute and deliver those in a consistent basis. But he's also the host of the #1 negotiating podcast in the world called Negotiating Ninja. Today, he's going to share insights from both organizations so that you can come into a negotiation better equipped and better positioned to get what you want. But he's also going to share insights on how you can develop and execute better content strategies. Now, let's hear what Mark has to say.
Good morning, Mark. I want to welcome you to our Ask an Expert.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right in. You've been quoted as saying, good negotiation has the power to change people's lives. Could you explain that?
Yeah, listen, negotiation is such an undervalued skill. And I think so many people view it as something that you're born with and can't necessarily be taught. And that is categorically incorrect.
Okay.
And if you can learn negotiation, you can increase the amount of value, not only financially, but socially, culturally, ecumenically, however you want to look at it.
Sure.
In your life, because it's something that just creates value in every area that you look at. And I think so many people miss out on that because they view negotiation as conflict,
Yeah.
when it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
Okay, well, so let's talk about that. So what is the difference between the perceived assessment of negotiation, which is this, hey, I have the leverage in this, I'm going to, be able to dominate, to what it really actually is?
Yeah, excellent question. So negotiation in and of itself is not a bad thing. And I think a lot of people come to it because it's just got a lot of baggage with it, because we perceive negotiation to be what the media tells us negotiation is, right? Like whenever we watch a political debate, or whenever we watch a movie where guys in Wall Street are slamming down their fists on the table and like screaming for what they want, negotiation's not that way at all. In fact, negotiation is very strategic in it, or it can be strategic in the way that you look at it. And so I think the perception, we've largely got the media to blame. I know they're getting a lot of flack these days, but I feel like the media is to blame for a lot of this, because there is this idea that negotiation has to involve significant conflict, and it doesn't. Now, that's not to say that conflict is a bad thing either. It's just to say that negotiation is about creating something, or negotiation done well is about creating something that drives mutual gain, right? Something that's going to be mutually beneficial for both of us. Because I want you to walk away from this feeling like you got something out of this deal, because the chances of us doing business together one day may be very high. Now, in a zero-sum negotiation, if you're negotiating for a car, you're probably never going to be there again. Go for it. Take all the money you can, right? Try and get everything you can out of that deal. But the vast majority of negotiations, they're just not that way. We're probably going to be dealing with that person or someone that person knows at some point in time. And so the result of that, of course, is that we should be doing something that's mutually beneficial. Now, that's not to say that we should give everything to the other side. We should also be looking out for our own interests, but it also doesn't mean that we should take everything.
Okay. So let's talk about negotiation from two aspects. The first is, how do you think about negotiation prior to walking into the negotiation? And then the second is, how do you actually think about it in that moment when you are in the process of negotiation?
I think a lot of people think that they're a lot more logical than they actually are.
Okay.
And there's I'll take this from two angles. So the vast majority of people go into a negotiation just to wing it, to see what they can get. And that is probably the biggest mistake you could ever make.
Right.
Before you go into any negotiation, I would suggest that you approach it at the very least, by understanding what do you need and what do you want out of this deal, and those are two different things, by the way.
Right.
So a need is something that you must have, a want is something that would be nice to have.
Sure.
So what do you need and what do you want? And then what is the counterparty, the people that you're negotiating with, what do they need and what do they want out of the negotiation? At a bare minimum, you should know that before you go into the deal.
Okay.
And then with that, you should know from that where you're going to walk away. At what point is the deal not going to make sense? You should know where your walkaway point is. Negotiation theorists call it a reservation point. At which point are you going to walk away from the deal? And that's incredibly important, because you don't want to make a deal. A bad deal is often worse than no deal.
Okay.
Because if you get stuck in a bad deal, then you're going to be paying a lot more money than you should have for that thing that you tried to buy or sell or whatever it might be.
Sure.
So a lot of people approach negotiation as winging it. As a bare minimum, you should approach it that way. But then when you get into the negotiation, there's a significant amount of people, even if they do plan, they take that plan and they throw it out the window, because they get emotional about the negotiation. They get tied up in the emotion of the negotiation. And emotion's not a bad thing. It's just that you have to manage it.
Right.
And negotiation in and of itself is quite emotional, because you're dealing with other people. And if you approach a situation that becomes frustrating, that maybe becomes conflict oriented, it's normal for our body to release stress hormones and create a stress response, and therefore we get emotional as a result.
Right.
Our job is to try and control that and stick to the plan as best we can.
Okay. We said something that's interesting there that I think a lot of people don't really take into consideration, which is, prior to going into that negotiation, you need to think about what your wants and what your needs are, but you also need to take into consideration the other people's wants and needs. Can you talk about what's a good way to try to assess that before you've walked into a room?
Excellent question. Yeah, I think the easiest way to try and assess that, obviously we're going to try and do as much research as we can prior to talking to someone, right? So you're going to do all of the liquidity analysis, capitalization analysis. You're going to identify whether or not the organization you're working with is going to be a going concern in 3 to 6 months, especially now, right? With everything that's going on economically in the world, you want to be sure that this company is actually going to be around when you do business with them. And I would never have said this 8 months ago. It wouldn't have been as big of a deal, but now it's obviously
it's a reality, right?
Yeah, it's reality. But even when you go into the negotiation, and I say negotiation because really the negotiation starts as soon as you contact someone, really, because you're creating perception immediately. I would start by asking really good open-ended questions. So an open-ended question is something that generates a response that's other than yes or no. So what are the challenges facing your organization? Why do you suppose your organization is facing those challenges? How do you plan on overcoming those challenges? Those are all open-ended questions. They start with what, how, and then sometimes how, and then sometimes why.
Okay.
And I say sometimes why because if you ask why the wrong way, it can come across kind of accusatory, like, why are you doing this?
Yeah, right.
So you've got to be very careful about how you phrase a why question. But when you ask open-ended questions, it generates conversation. And then when you start to generate conversation, now you can start asking questions that deliver information to you about what are the things that they need? What are the things that they want? And unless you know what they need and want, it's very difficult for you to come to a solution that's mutually beneficial for both parties, right? So you've got to know what they need and want in order to get to a deal that makes sense.
Okay. So the next question I have is team versus individual negotiation. What are the pitfalls and what are the pros of each one of those?
I would say if you can, always try and go in with a team.
Okay.
And your team should be made up of at minimum 3 different types of people or 3 different roles.
Sure.
So the negotiator, someone who's doing the talking,
Yep.
the listener and the observer, right? Someone who's actually observing the negotiation, and then the scribe, which is someone who's taking notes.
Okay.
And I say those roles independently because I think so often we try and go into the negotiation alone, and there's a lot of pride and ego that's attached to it. Like we think that we have to do it alone.
Right.
It doesn't have to be that way, because you're not going to be able to effectively manage each and every single one of those tasks at the same time. We're not, as much as we would love to believe that we are, humans are not great at multitasking, right? We're not great at doing multiple things at once. I mean, there's a reason that we evolved with eyes in the front of our heads, because we're focused on one thing at a time. We're
Right.
hunters historically, and have been for a very long time. You look at deer, for example, eyes on the side, they're checking things out, they're eating grass, doing all what they need to do.
Yeah.
We're not that way. We're supposed to be focused on one thing at a time. And the result is, if we try and do it alone, we're going to miss something. And one of the biggest issues that I see in the vast majority of teams that I teach is that there's details that they miss in the course of the negotiation because they're trying to do everything all at once. And then they assume that people have agreed to something that they haven't necessarily agreed to. 3 months down the line, an issue comes up and they said, no, we agreed to that. We agreed that that wasn't an issue. And they're like, well, where are the notes? Like, where is it in the contract? How come it doesn't say this? Well,
Right.
like, no, but we talked about it. Well, how come no one wrote it down? And so now we have an issue where we've missed something. Now we have to try our best to negotiate that after the fact, when we could have taken care of that on the front end. So while it may seem like more of an investment of time to have a team-based approach, it actually shortens the amount of time that you have to deal with issues on the back end.
Okay.
And so now with that team-based approach, you're able to capture more information, you're able to be more detailed, and you just avoid so many issues in the long run.
Okay, and so it sounds like, when you've got the observer, you've got the scribe, you're able to stay in your lane, which is you're able to be much more dedicated to the actual
Yes,
negotiation in itself.
exactly.
When we're talking about negotiation, when we understand, hey, I know what my wants, I know what my needs are, I've got a really good understanding of what their wants and needs are. What are the levers that we have during this process that we can get us closer to our wants as opposed to just our needs?
Yeah, excellent. So understanding how you can pull different levers
Right.
is a big part of negotiation. The key with a lever is to create leverage, right? So you, throughout the negotiation, what we're trying to do is build leverage in the negotiation. So this is why we ask really good open-ended questions.
Okay.
So let's just say, for example, I was going to ask you, what are the challenges facing your organization? And you said, hey, with everything that's going on in the economy right now, cash flow has been really brutal, but all of the people that are buying from us are trying to extend out payment terms. And so now we don't have as significant cash flow. And so it's just been crazy. But, we're just like everyone else, and, one step at a time. Well, what have you learned from that? Well, you've learned that cash flow is a problem.
Yep.
Maybe this is a problem that you can help them solve.
Sure.
And so where so many people get mixed up in negotiation about building leverage, they think it's only about the power that you build. It's
Yeah.
about the problems that the other party has that you could potentially solve for them.
Okay.
So maybe you could actually create a situation where you pay them faster. Now you've become a priority in their mind because you
Yep.
create significantly more cash flow for them.
Mm.
Like you pay them on 15 days instead of 60 days, for example.
Yep.
And now you become a strategic partner for them. Now you can pull that lever whenever you want. You found out what the problem is.
Yep.
Now you can decide to trade that for something else at any point in the negotiation. So I could say to the person later on in the negotiation, look, throughout our discussion, one thing that I learned is that cash flow is really important to you guys. And right now you're having a lot of problems with people paying their bills on time. People are extending out payment terms. What if we could help you solve that problem? What
Sure.
if we could pay you faster? Would that help you? Now we're trying to assess how important that thing is. Now we can create leverage in the negotiation. Now that only comes as a result of asking really good questions.
Right.
This is such an underused skill because people feel like when they ask questions, they may lose control of the negotiation, like it may go one direction or another. Just let it go.
Okay.
The more control that you try to place on it, the less control you actually have to find out what matters to that counterparty.
Right.
So when you ask the question, let them answer it and then probe. Like find out why. Why is this important to them?
Yeah.
What is it that drives this? What is the cost driver to this thing that they're doing?
Sure.
The more information that you find out about that, the more information you find strategically where you can start to pull levers in the negotiation. This helps you to build informational power, and then you can go through the negotiation that way. Now, we can get into a massive conversation about the different types of power that you can build
Yeah.
in the negotiation, but this single piece of power alone is going to be super helpful to you.
So it sounds like something, what I'm taking away here is this informational gathering session is something that happens in advance of the actual negotiation.
It happens throughout the negotiation, not just in advance, right? Because you're going to uncover information
Right.
throughout. That's why I say the negotiation doesn't just, there is no set time for
Right.
the negotiation. There's not like some allocated time on the phone that we say, okay, now we're negotiating. That actually begins way before the first contact, the first phone call, the first email, because we're trying to build information. We're trying to get data to help us with that negotiation. So it happens throughout. And that's a big misconception that a lot of people have is there's no negotiation. You're already negotiating.
Right.
Whether you like it or not, you've set a precedence for how you're going to approach things.
Sure.
You've created a perception in the counterparty's mind about who you are and how you approach things. So be very weary about how you approach the negotiation, because what you're doing is setting yourself up for either success or failure.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of businesses think of negotiations as kind of binary, which is
Right.
when I'm actually on the final call and we're setting terms, that is the negotiation. But the really valuable takeaway is all of this to the actual close of the deal is just how much value there is in taking your time and doing your due diligence, so that you can go into it, being better equipped. So I'm curious from a strategic standpoint, so we're a marketing agency. We help, organizations lead gen. As you're starting your business, what was the process you went through from a marketing standpoint to get your name out there, to start building the brand, and getting it to where you guys are today?
Biggest focus for us from the beginning and to this day has always been about content and making sure that we're producing great content. So we have a podcast called the Negotiations Ninja Podcast, which is the #1 negotiation podcast in the world.
Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
awesome. We're stoked about it. And just producing great blog posts, great interviews, great video clips, because I feel like that really has separated us amongst all other training companies to show that we are on the leading edge, or the bleeding edge, I should say, of negotiation theory and understanding. And that's really important to us because we want to be set apart from the rest of the competition. So if we're not producing thought leadership content, then I feel like we're falling behind. So we've always tried to put our listeners and our customers first. And in fact, our tagline is to develop and deliver the most engaging negotiation content in the world.
Mhm.
So whether it's training or whether it's coaching, it's content focused first.
Right.
We always try and lead with good content, and then everything else, whether it's SEM or SEO, whatever we're doing after the fact, builds off of that content.
Okay, so great to hear that. There's the saying, content is king. But I know personally, and I know a lot of business owners, they dread, or they've gone through this period of dreading, right? So knowing that you guys have this very successful podcast, I was going into this thinking, what is your process to maintain and to constantly come up with fresh content, that you're able to set the ball in motion and continue it? Because I feel like before people even start it, they've already, like, they've hit roadblocks. It's mental, or maybe they do one or two, excuse me, and then they kind of flame out. So what is the process you guys have to have this long running podcast?
Great question. I mean, we're fortunate that we live and work in a space that's got an endless amount of ideas, right? So whether it's negotiation, behavioral science, sales, procurement, M&A, they're all sort of tied into each other when it
Right.
comes to negotiation. So when you think of it from that perspective, really there's an endless amount of questions or content ideas or whatever it might be. And I think this is where a lot of people really fall flat on the content idea is they think that it just has, like, let's say you're a plumbing business. They think that it just has to do with running pipe or whatever it might be.
Right.
It doesn't, right? There's so much more to the plumbing business that you're not necessarily thinking about. What are the leadership components that are required for running a plumbing business? How do you develop tradespeople in the plumbing business? How do you show safety in the plumbing business? All of these things are critical to making sure that a plumbing business could be successful. But for whatever reason, all we think about is one pipe joining another pipe, and therefore that's the end of the podcast.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So what I would encourage people to think about, just expand your mindset to think about what actually goes into this, right? Who are all the different types of businesses that we need to interact with? Who are all the different stakeholders that we interact with? How does the business actually work? How are we, helping people to do their business as a result of our business? How do we all tie into each other? And I think it's got to come from having an idea of what your major defining purpose is. So figuring out why you exist, what is the reason you exist, and then think about who are you the antithesis of, right?
Mm.
Who do you not want to be?
Right.
And then from there, build down what are your, let's say, your competitive advantages that show that that's your major defining purpose. How do you separate yourself from the competition? And
Sure.
then build your content off of all that stuff. That's a great starting point to say, okay, this is what we do better than everyone else. Let's talk about that first, and then ideas will spring from that.
Okay, so that's very insightful. I talked with Sasha Strauss, and he was telling me that, a lot of people have this perception. I don't want to give away too much information,
Mhm.
and he used the painter analogy. I'm going to hire somebody to paint my house. If I actually am there while they're painting it and they're explaining what they're doing, I'm not going to go paint my house, but I'm going to have a better appreciation for what went into that. And I think business owners have this fearful, thought process, like, oh, I can't tip my cards, too much. But, the reality is, most people aren't going to go, oh, here's the secret recipe, I'm going to go steal this business. You're already vested in it. You're already off and running. It's a great way for you to open the doors and really, to your point, what is that value proposition, right? What are the things? Why are you here? What is the message? And those are intangibles that actually make your offering much more engaging.
Oh, big time. Yeah,
Right.
I think there's I run into this all the time where people are like, Mark, why are you giving so much away? And I know it sounds sort of counterintuitive, but the more that we give away, the more business that we get. And it's kind of a weird concept to sort of wrap your head around. I get it, because when I was first doing it, I was like, oh, like I feel like we're giving away the secret sauce here.
Right.
Uh, but I know he's sort of like a very polarizing figure, but if you think of Gary Vee, for example,
Yeah. Right.
he gives everything away, like everything that he just secured this massive deal to sell his wine company. Within a day, he was online telling people exactly how they structured the deal and how it all went out and all that kind of
Right.
stuff. And you would think to yourself, like, why would this guy do this? He knows that 99.9% of people are never going to do that. And the information is not, it's not going to be stolen, but it's going to be used by someone who's listening to him and go, man, this guy really knows what he's talking about. We should probably do business with this person.
Exactly.
And that's what's getting created. You're creating a thought leadership brand. You're not giving away your secrets.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and definitely he can be polarizing, but I think that he has shown a blueprint that actually shows, hey, there is tremendous amount of value because
Huge.
people will that have the ability to engage with him, like Constellation Brands that bought, his wine business. They see the value in that, and he's doing these big deals.
Absolutely.
You have a firm called Content Callout. So I want to dig further. What are some of the mistakes that you see businesses doing right now as it pertains to content?
Not producing it. I think that's probably the biggest mistake
That's
that
a
I
big one.
see. Uh, I mean, that's where we get hired, right? Because Content Call Out is a content creation firm. So a lot of businesses are so stuck on traditional advertising, I feel, and traditional media that they don't think about what they're doing, what their strategy is for marketing. So let's put it from this perspective. Typically in the past, you've viewed marketing, and people, I feel, have viewed marketing as like hey, buy my stuff. Here's an ad, right? You're going to run, a search ad on Google, click here to buy my stuff. And yes, those are effective. I'm not saying that they're not effective. Definitely they are. But anyone can do that. Anyone can run an ad. And so now you're competing for clicks. Essentially, you're paying for clicks. What keeps someone coming back to your website? What keeps someone coming back to read more? It's the content. So yes, the click could get someone in the door, but what gets someone coming back to keep interacting with you? Because they're not going to buy on one click typically, right? So you're going to have to keep retargeting them through SEM, and then also focusing them on your content to ensure that you're building that trust.
Right.
And that's what I think a lot of people and a lot of businesses miss, is that yes, you can get them in the door, but now how are you building that trust? How are you building that likability? Because we all know that people do business with that like and trust. And if we're not building that online in some sort of capacity, whether it's through social content or blog content or newsletter content, video content, whatever it might be, we're missing out on massive opportunities to get future customers.
Sure. So you guys, how many episodes do you guys have of your podcast?
We are on 160, I think.
Okay.
We just recorded 160 something.
Okay, so that's a tremendous portfolio that you guys have. I think that podcast is a great medium for you to share because it allows you to do storytelling, right? And storytelling is just this great vehicle to deliver, and more importantly to me, I think engage people into the content that you have. When it comes to podcasts, I've been hearing, I'm a big podcast listener. Been listening to podcasts. Serial was the big one that got a lot of people in, and I'm on that bandwagon. Back then I had heard people saying, hey, as a business, you should put together a podcast. You should be a thought leader in your space. That's 5-6 years ago. What was the process for you guys to actually start it and get over the hurdle? Because I do think that there's a mental hurdle that says, oh, well, it's a podcast. I'm a plumber. I don't do, it's complicated. But I don't think it's as complicated as people think. And you guys are over 160 episodes and you're on cruise control at this point, right? So can you talk about that process?
Yeah, it's not as hard as you think it is. And I think it's a great idea for a lot of business. First of all, I don't think everyone should create a podcast,
Sure.
um, especially if you don't have the capacity to begin with, because it
Right.
does take a lot of time when
Right.
you're starting out. When you get rolling, it's a lot easier because you've got your schedules and your routine down. But how we actually started off on a dare, where, as all good things start, I was in a bar with a few friends, and I had already started a blog, and they said, well, you should start a podcast, because I was bitching and moaning about good communication negotiation content
Um,
out there on podcasts. And they said, well, don't bitch about it, like, start one.
Fill the
um,
void.
yeah, fill the void, right? Don't sit here and moan about it. And so, I had a few more drinks, and it sounded like a great idea. And so the next day I realized that I had been on Amazon that night and bought all of the wrong equipment. and made a massive financial mistake, and then started learning. It was a steep learning curve, and the feedback that I get from everyone who is thinking about starting a podcast, and if you're thinking about it, you probably should. If you're thinking about starting a podcast, the major feedback I get is like, well, I don't really have anything to add. There's
Yeah.
so much out there already. Why would anyone listen to me? That's less important than actually doing it.
Okay.
Because by doing it, what you're going to realize is that you've got a ton to add.
Right.
And it also creates a great top of funnel marketing approach.
Yeah.
So even if you've only got a few listeners to begin with, as you build up, as all of us will, right? You're going to have 10, 20 listeners in your first 3 episodes, and then you're going to build from there,
Right.
start with family and friends. It's how just so you're clear, it's how everyone started. You don't have to freak out. That in and of itself is going to separate you as the thought leader, right? I have a plumbing podcast. I didn't know plumbing had enough information to have a podcast. Like, how are you guys doing a plumbing podcast? Well, it's something that we're super passionate about. We want to tell our customers that we really live this stuff. And so we're putting out all this stuff for builders and whoever. Now you are the plumbing guy or the plumbing girl, right? Like, once you can create that image and build on that thought leadership image, when people think about plumbing, they think about you. They think about your business. You think about all the great brands that have started off, like you think about Coca-Cola, for example, or Red Bull. Like, they're media companies that just happen to sell soft drinks, really, right? Their content comes first in almost every single thing that they do. If you can structure your business that way, you become the person in that space.
Right. Well, I like what you said, which is be focused on the content, because I do think that there's this perception that, and we're going through this, and you went through it, but you started out with a handful of viewers, and you're now the #1 negotiation podcast, out there. But that took time, right? And I think that there's this perception like, well, who's going to want to listen? If you're focused on the content, there's people that are interested. There's people that do want to listen, and you can fill that space. So I think that's an important takeaway.
Yeah, and don't focus on like building the following. Just focus on putting out good stuff.
Exactly.
Look, your first few episodes are gonna suck. Mine sucked. Like, if you listen to the first 50, 60 episodes that we ever did, they are brutal. They are terrible. But we keep them up because we want to show the evolution. We want to show people where we came from to where we went to. And that's an amazing journey, because you're creating something out of nothing. Just like when you started your plumbing business or whatever kind of business you run, you've created something entirely new that didn't exist before, and now you get to use that. That's now an asset that will bring in customers for you. And once you start to see and track how you're bringing in customers as a result of this top of funnel content that you're producing, it's going to create massive dividends for your company.
Love it. We had Robert Glazer on, and he was talking about, he has an email that he sends out Friday forward. And it started, with like 20 employees that he was sending it to. And now he has 200,000 people.
Amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. But he said, it was kind of the hockey stick kind of deal where, he just focused on the content, right? Here's something that's interesting. I have a point of view, and I'm gonna write about that. And at some point, whether it was year 3 or year 4, that's when it really started to build momentum. But he stayed in his lane, because the point wasn't to build the audience. The point was to make the content, and the audience will follow. So I love hearing that you guys went through very similar to that. So you talked about this, and I feel weird talking about this when we talk about the podcast and it's content first and it's stay true to that. But it is a vehicle for your business. And so Absolutely. I do want to talk about that. Like, explore how that has been, not just specifically from a lead gen, but what are the facets that the podcast is opened up for your guys' organization?
It's opened up a ton of opportunities. So just because you are creating this thought leadership content doesn't mean you can't talk about your business,
Right.
right? So leading in to say, we're the leading negotiation provider, XYZ, whatever kind of business you run, leading plumbing business in,
Sure.
the Pacific Northwest or wherever, you can still say that, oh, and this is our podcast, right? Lead into the content. And it also allows you access to places you probably would never have had access to. So for example, getting speaking invitations to conferences because you're, the plumbing person.
Right.
Now that opens up significantly more doors because now you're speaking at that conference as a thought leader in
Sure.
the space. Your additional content on your podcast trickles down to additional content that you can put online in articles and in blog posts, in audiograms, in a book that you may want to write on leadership in the plumbing business or the plumbing business in general. Whatever it is that you want to do, it just gives you additional access that you would never have had before. It also draws people to you. So when you put out your plumbing podcast or whatever it might be, people who are interested and continue to listen will reach out to you and say, hey, let's talk, let's have a conversation. And sometimes those conversations lead to significantly bigger deals. So for example, in the negotiation podcast that we run, there have been people that have reached out 3 years from listening from the first single episode. I had no idea who they were.
Right.
But they reach out 3 years later to say, hey, Mark, we need some negotiation training for our company, for our team. By the way, there's 3,000 people that need to get trained across the globe. These are all the different locations that we need to do. We're basically willing to spend any amount of money possible to make sure that this gets done. Blank check, go make it happen.
Wow.
Now, that would never have happened if I didn't have the show. And so many people think, oh man, it's so much work. And look, it's a lot of work. I'm not going to discount that.
Sure.
But the opportunities that it opens for you are huge. The people that if you have like this, for example, if you have an interview style show, the people that you'll get to speak to and the doors that opens is massive, because now you're giving people a platform. And when you give people a platform to speak about what they're passionate about, it's creating reciprocity. You're giving them a gift. And now you've created the opportunity for reciprocity to occur. So when you produce this, for example, I'm going to reshare it. You're going to get access to all of my network. And now we're going to be sharing with each other. We're going to know each other. That's going to open up more opportunities. The upside of a podcast is massive. Massive.
Well, I love that. Well, so first off, congratulations, because that's incredible, and it's why I want to talk about it, right? Because I am very passionate about the content side of things, but I don't want to be dismissive. It's not the reason to do it, but the reality is there's tremendous backside to it.
Huge.
And I love that you used, this is arbitrary, but I'm really interested in this now as we've been talking about it. I love that you used the plumbing example, because I think that that's a perfect business that is,
Exactly.
it's this blue collar,
old school.
Yeah, right. And so as we've been talking about it, I'm just sitting here going, man, I feel like there's a tremendous opportunity for, some plumber out there to really embrace this. And I hope that, someday, maybe a year down the road, I'm going to be calling you and saying, hey, remember this conversation? Well, there's Bob, and he's in California. He's now the plumbing king of, the country, because he started a podcast.
Right. And there's like there's so many people think that there's all the good ideas are taken.
Right.
And that's so untrue.
Right.
There's so many opportunities. There's so many gaps in this space right now. And you look at how quickly this has progressed.
Sure.
Like look at Rogan's deal with Spotify, right? Like that's the first big deal that we've seen of any like content producer to get onto one platform. That's going to continue to happen. And you think of all the niche disciplines that could happen in.
Yeah.
man, sky's the limit.
Sky's the limit. We're doing this over video, and so video has been around. Video's been pushed for I don't know, 5 years, right? It's been this medium that really is. It's only been seen in marketing standpoints as the conventional advertising. We're putting a commercial, a 30-second spot or a 15-second
Right.
spot. But in the past 3 months, it's been thrust upon us. But most of that has been internal, right? It's been I'm talking to my colleague that used to sit right next to me, but we have to be apart right now. What's your guys' take on video? How are you using it, and how do you think it's going to continue to be used more outward facing within, whether it's one-to-one, or maybe it's a group, or just I feel video gives you this authentic voice because it is your voice, as opposed to this manufactured 30-second spot. So share what you guys are doing and what you see.
So Albert Marabanian, and there are some people that dispute his study, but it's the most commonly cited study on how people communicate.
Okay.
The vast majority of our communication is nonverbal, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
so how we show up.
Yep.
And that's body language, that's how we look, how we feel, how we intonate, all of that kind of stuff is super, super important. And by cutting that out, by doing audio only, which is what we've done for a long time, we are now missing out on all of the ways that we could be communicating with someone.
Right.
The way that we look at platforms now is totally changing. I mean, you look at how quickly TikTok has grown. Like,
Yeah.
unbelievable. What is it now? The number 3 social network in the world, and no one knew what it was a year ago.
Right.
And it's grown so fast because of video.
Right.
And I think the more that you can do on video, it becomes sort of that platform piece of content that you can break down from there, the easier your life's going to be, because that'll spin off all the multiple opportunities that you can do. Also, you show people who you really are. To your point, there's no facade anymore,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Right.
maybe you've got you're a little bit nervous, and audio helps you better. Great. But what I would recommend to you is, when you do the video content, people see that sincerity. People see a genuine approach to try and do something. And people's bullshit meters are like dialed in hard these days, like really well. And if they can't see that you're sincere, if they can't see that you're genuine, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to trust you. So I think video is the future. And I think voice, like how Google and Amazon are taking voice, I think the long tail implications of voice are going to be big too.
Okay. Well, I love it. And I do think you're right. Bullshit meters are at an all-time high. And this gives you this opportunity. And the thing that I'm optimistic about is, I think if we asked most businesses 3 months ago, like, hey, are you willing to put yourself in front of the camera, they're going to say no, right? Because it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. But so many of us have been forced into it that I'm hopeful that facade of this weird, it's video, my voice, my sound, whatever, that people are past that, and it allows them to just be themselves, and communicate what their thoughts are, what their value proposition, more eloquently, more authentically.
Yeah, totally agree. I think it's so important. And the more that we, social distance, the more that video is going to become more commonplace. And I think hopefully the easier it's going to become for people to incorporate into what they do.
Okay. Well, so last question, which is there anything you think is important that you're seeing in the marketplace, or that you think people should be seeing, that we haven't talked about, that you want to share?
I think people have got to be if you're thinking about it from a marketing perspective, you've got to be very aware of how COVID-19, and whenever this gets published, I'm sure we'll still be talking about this.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But what post COVID-19 looks like for marketing. And because what's happening, and I had a really interesting conversation with Rashad Tabakawala, who used to be the chief growth officer for Publicis Group. Was one of the top communication companies in the world. He said that this time is habit forming, and that's what people have to wrap their head around, right? Habits get formed in about 60 days. At the time of recording this for the listeners, we're at like 90 days, maybe closer to 100. And so by the time that this gets published, we're going to be over 120 days potentially. And now habits have been formed about how people approach purchasing and the market and interaction. And then now you've got to think about, how is my business going to react or respond to the new habits that have been formed? And if you think you can do things the old way, if you think that you can, throw up your ad on a billboard, for example, you're going to have a lot of trouble. So I would just say, be thoughtful about how you're going to approach marketing based on how things are changing in people's habits.
Well, I like that, and that kind of comes full circle to the beginning and the big takeaway that I got when we talk about negotiation, which is just being mindful, right? Thinking about it before you're actually taking action,
Yes.
and be deliberate in that process, because especially in this marketplace, so much has changed and so much is going to continue to change. That if you don't take that time, you're putting your business at peril
Yep.
to get passed by. So.
Absolutely.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for coming on. A lot of great info. So I am excited to get this posted. And I look forward to having you back because this has just been fun.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. This was great.
Okay. Well, be well to you, your team, and to your family.
Likewise.
All right. Thanks.